That is what your dignity is worth. $5 for the girl who brings my steak," the rich man said loudly, his voice cutting through the warm evening chatter of the restaurant like a knife across glass. For a brief moment, the entire dining room seemed to forget how to breathe. Silverware stopped clinking. A couple near the window froze mid-conversation. The scent of grilled ribeye and garlic butter still floated in the air, but now it mixed with something heavier, the quiet discomfort that spreads when cruelty enters a room uninvited. The man who had spoken sat at the center of a polished oak table, surrounded by three well-dressed friends. His name was Richard Collins, a man whose expensive watch flashed beneath the golden lights every time he lifted his hand. In front of him lay the bill for his meal, neatly folded beside a single $5 bill that he had placed on the table with deliberate slowness. Across from him stood the waitress he had chosen to humiliate. Her name tag read Ava Johnson. She held a small leather check holder in both hands, her posture calm, her shoulders straight. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. Yet several people in the room sensed that something about her composure did not match the role the man had assigned her. Ava had dark curls pulled back neatly and a plain black apron tied at her waist. To anyone glancing quickly, she looked like any other server working the dinner rush, moving from table to table with quiet efficiency. But the stillness in her eyes made one elderly woman at a nearby table pause and watch more carefully. Richard Collins leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention that his remark had created. One of his friends chuckled under his breath, while another lifted his phone slightly, as if tempted to record the moment. Ava remained standing beside the table. She glanced once at the $5 bill resting beside the receipt, then lifted her eyes toward the man with a calm expression that made the silence in the room grow even deeper. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now back to what happened in that restaurant that night, because what began with a cruel joke over $5 would become something no one in that dining room would ever forget. Ava Johnson gently set the leather check holder down on the edge of the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and steady, carrying just far enough for those closest to hear. She said that if the service was not satisfactory, then the tip was not necessary. Her tone held no anger, only quiet professionalism. That calm response seemed to irritate Richard Collins even more than if she had argued. He leaned forward, tapping the $5 bill with a finger that wore a thick gold ring. He said that generosity should be appreciated, especially by someone in her position. A few people at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. One man lowered his gaze to his plate, pretending not to listen, while the elderly woman who had been watching now studied Ava more closely, as though trying to place a familiar face she could not quite remember. Ava reached for the bill, preparing to clear the table the way she had done hundreds of times before during long evening shifts. But something about the way Richard Collins smiled told everyone nearby that he believed the humiliation was not finished yet. In the quiet seconds that followed, no one in that restaurant realized that within minutes the balance of power in that room was about to change in a way none of them could possibly predict. The silence that followed Richard Collins' laughter spread slowly through the restaurant like cold air slipping under a door. For several seconds, no one spoke. The faint music drifting from the ceiling speakers suddenly felt too quiet, too careful, as if even the room itself understood that something uncomfortable had just happened. Ava Johnson lifted the small leather check holder from the table and held it gently against her apron. Her movements were smooth and practiced, the kind that came from long hours balancing trays and navigating crowded dining rooms. Yet her eyes remained steady on the man in front of her, not challenging him, not pleading with him, simply observing. Richard Collins seemed to enjoy the attention. He leaned back in his chair and stretched one arm along the back of the booth, as if he owned the entire room. The gold watch on his wrist caught the warm light from the chandeliers above, sending a brief flash across the polished surface of the table. One of his friends chuckled again, louder this time, encouraged by the silence of the surrounding guests. Another friend lifted his glass of red wine and took a slow sip while watching Ava with mild curiosity. Richard tapped the $5 bill again with his finger. The small sound echoed louder than it should have. He said that some people worked all week hoping for a tip like that. His tone carried the easy arrogance of a man who had spent most of his life being obeyed. A young couple at the table beside them exchanged uneasy glances. The woman lowered her eyes toward her plate, while the man shifted in his chair as though considering whether he should say something. But no one spoke. Restaurants had their own unwritten rules, and one of them was that customers rarely interfered with another table. Ava breathed in slowly. The scent of roasted garlic and butter filled the air again as a server passed behind her, carrying a tray of fresh plates toward the kitchen. Somewhere near the bar, a glass clinked softly against another. Ordinary sounds, small reminders that life inside the restaurant continued even when a moment turned awkward. Ava finally reached forward and picked up the $5 bill between two fingers. For a brief instant, a room seemed to lean closer. She studied the bill as if confirming its value. Then she placed it back on the table exactly where it had been. Her voice remained calm when she spoke. She said that generosity was a matter of choice and that every guest was free to leave whatever tip felt right to them. There was no sarcasm in her tone. No anger. That calmness irritated Richard Collins even more than defiance might have. He leaned forward now, elbows resting on the table, his smile tightening. He said that people like her always try to sound polite when they were really begging for more money. His friend with the phone finally lifted it high enough to begin recording. The small red light on the screen reflected faintly against the glass of water beside Richard's plate. A man at a nearby table cleared his throat quietly, clearly uncomfortable, but still said nothing. Ava noticed the phone for a moment, then looked back at Richard. Something about her expression made the elderly woman near the window narrow her eyes in curiosity. It was not fear that showed on Ava's face. It was patience. The kind of patience that usually belonged to someone who had faced far worse than a cruel remark in a restaurant. Richard gestured toward the dining room with a lazy wave of his hand, as if presenting a stage. He said that everyone could see exactly how grateful a waitress should be for a $5 tip. His friends laughed again, though the laughter sounded thinner this time, less confident. Ava rested her hands lightly against the edge of the table. She thanked him quietly for visiting the restaurant and asked if there was anything else he needed before she cleared the plates. For a moment, Richard looked surprised by the question. Then his smile returned, sharper than before. He said yes. Actually, there was something else he needed. He needed her to admit that she expected more money than she deserved. A few diners shifted in their seats. The tension in the room had grown thick enough to feel. Ava held his gaze for a second longer. The warm light above them reflected softly in her dark eyes. Then she gave a small nod and reached for the plates. What no one in that restaurant realized in that moment was that the quiet waitress they were watching had spent years standing in rooms far more intense than this one. Rooms filled not with laughter and wine glasses, but with bright surgical lights and the steady sound of machines measuring the fragile distance between life and death. Ava Johnson moved through the bustling restaurant with a grace that belied the tension at the table she had just served. The clatter of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation filled the room again, yet her focus remained unwavering. She adjusted the small stack of clean plates on her tray and walked toward the kitchen, her steps measured, precise, each one carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had spent years in environments where every action mattered. The rich man, Richard Collins, leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the display of obedience he believed he had inspired. He did not notice the faint narrowing of eyes among a few diners who had witnessed his behavior. Ava paused at the entrance to the kitchen, taking a slow breath, feeling the cool draft that slipped through the door. She placed the plates carefully on the counter and allowed herself a moment to center her thoughts. Her mind, trained for focus in far more intense circumstances, began to replay the events of the past 5 minutes. She had been insulted, made the subject of a cruel joke, yet her calm exterior had never wavered. Every muscle in her body was poised, ready to respond if the situation escalated, but she trusted in her composure and the presence of others to maintain order. Meanwhile, Richard Collins, unaware of the internal strength he had encountered, gestured for another drink from the server at the bar. The elderly woman near the window whispered to her companion, commenting softly on Ava's poise, as if recognizing a rare composure in someone so young yet so grounded. Ava returned to the table to clear the empty plates, moving carefully to avoid the $5 bill that still lay untouched beside the check. She bent slightly to lift the dishes, and for a moment, the polished floor reflected her calm expression back at her. She spoke quietly to the couple seated near the corner, thanking them for their patience while the table was being cleared. Her voice, warm and professional, seemed to fill the quiet spaces around her without raising a single eyebrow among the diners. Richard Collins tapped the table impatiently, signaling to his friends, yet no one moved toward Ava aggressively. There was a subtle shift in the energy around the table, a tension that was not immediately perceptible but existed nonetheless, as if the room itself were waiting for the next move. Ava replaced the plates on the tray and straightened, glancing once at the $5 bill and then at the man who had spoken so harshly moments before. Her expression remained unreadable, a mask perfected over countless shifts in crowded, high-pressure environments. A waitress from the opposite side of the room caught her eye and offered a subtle nod of solidarity. Ava returned the gesture with a small smile that conveyed acknowledgement without distraction. She then turned her attention to a nearby server carrying a tray of drinks, stepping aside with practiced ease to allow the passage without collision. Her movements, though ordinary to an observer, carried an undercurrent of control and poise that suggested far more experience than her uniform implied. Back at the table, Richard Collins glanced around the dining room, noticing the curious stares of a few guests who had witnessed the earlier exchange. He shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his posture to appear more dominant, yet the tightness in his jaw betrayed a slight unease. Ava returned to the edge of the room, near the kitchen, placing her tray down once more and allowing herself a moment to observe the flow of the restaurant. She noted the placement of tables, the positions of servers, and the line of sight of Richard Collins, anticipating every potential interaction. For all the apparent chaos of a busy Friday evening, Ava had created a small zone of control, a space where her dignity remained intact despite the insult. The restaurant continued around her, diners chatting, glasses clinking, and servers moving with practiced efficiency, yet the air near her remained charged with the quiet anticipation of what might happen next. Ava took a deep breath, letting the moment settle, knowing that the next steps in this encounter would determine not only the immediate outcome, but also how the balance of power in the room would shift in ways no one had yet imagined. Ava Johnson paused for a moment near the corner of the dining room, her tray resting lightly against her hip, and allowed herself a brief glance toward Richard Collins. His posture was commanding, his back straight, one hand drumming impatiently on the polished oak surface of the table, yet there was an undercurrent of tension in the way his eyes flicked across the room. He had made a spectacle of her moments ago, and now he seemed uncertain of how to maintain the authority he had so confidently asserted. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow across the room, illuminating the expensive table settings and the glassware that reflected the subtle flicker of candlelight. Ava observed the pattern of movement in the room, noting the server who had just passed with a tray of salads, the couple at the window adjusting their chairs slightly, and the young man at the bar who seemed to be holding his phone a little higher, as though trying to capture something without being obvious. The tension between her and the man at the table was palpable, a silent battle of composure and observation. Ava adjusted her grip on the tray and moved quietly toward another table, making sure to place each plate down without a sound, the faint clink of porcelain barely audible. Every step was precise, measured, and deliberate, as though she were threading through a minefield of observation and judgment. In her mind, she ran through the details of the previous interaction, noting Richard's tone, his gestures, the way he positioned his friends to reinforce his statement, and she calculated her responses with a clarity that came from years of navigating spaces where power and reputation dictated behavior. The elderly woman near the window continued to watch, her gaze shifting between Ava and the man who had insulted her, curiosity mixed with a growing sense of admiration. A faint smile touched the corner of the woman's lips as she seemed to recognize strength beneath the ordinary appearance of the waitress. Ava returned to the table to refill a glass of water, bending slightly to do so, and in that moment, the room held its breath. Richard noticed the movement and leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her carefully, as if trying to anticipate what she might do next. He had not encountered anyone with her calm resilience before, and it unsettled him more than he would admit. Ava placed the glass gently on the table, her hands steady, and offered a polite nod, acknowledging the presence of the diners without inviting attention to herself. She noticed the slight stiffening in Richard's shoulders and the way his friends were beginning to exchange subtle glances, a silent communication that something unexpected was unfolding. Moving back toward the edge of the room, Ava allowed herself a brief pause to observe the flow of the evening service. The hum of conversation, the occasional laughter, the soft clatter of dishes being cleared, all seemed to contrast sharply with the quiet storm brewing at the table she had just served. Her posture remained straight, her gaze calm, and she allowed the room to settle around her while she prepared for whatever might come next. In that moment, Ava Johnson was more than a waitress. She was a presence that commanded attention through quiet control and dignity, a figure who had experienced far more intense and consequential situations and was capable of navigating this one without losing composure. Richard Collins shifted slightly in his seat, a subtle sign of discomfort he could not entirely mask, and leaned back. With a tightening of his jaw, the room seemed to notice the imperceptible change, as if the balance of power had begun to tilt ever so slightly. Ava adjusted her tray one final time and moved toward the kitchen entrance, her movements fluid, her eyes briefly meeting the curious gaze of the elderly woman before returning to the rhythm of her service. The moment had passed in terms of immediate action, but the tension lingered, a quiet expectation that something significant was on the horizon, waiting for the next turn in this silent battle of poise and authority. Every step Ava took, every careful gesture, reinforced her quiet command over the situation, and even as the normal rhythm of the restaurant resumed, the memory of Richard Collins' statement and her calm response remained in the air, a precursor to the revelations that would soon follow. Ava Johnson paused near the end of the service corridor, her tray lightly balanced in both hands, and took a measured breath before returning to the table where Richard Collins still sat, his expression shifting between irritation and curiosity. She had observed him closely over the past minutes, noting the subtle changes in posture, the way his fingers tapped nervously on the table, and the flickers of doubt crossing his face despite his attempts at maintaining a commanding presence. Ava adjusted her apron, the dark fabric brushing against her forearms as she straightened her shoulders, signaling a quiet readiness for the next interaction. She approached the table with deliberate calm, each step calculated to convey both professionalism and unspoken strength, a presence that immediately drew attention from nearby diners who sensed the unusual tension. Richard Collins lifted his head, catching the measured look in Ava's eyes, and for the first time since he had delivered his harsh remark, a hint of uncertainty crept into his demeanor. Ava placed her tray on the sideboard near the table, her hands steady, and took a moment to ensure the area around her remained undisturbed, mindful of the small details that often went unnoticed by those preoccupied with status and power. She then turned her gaze back to Richard Collins, maintaining a posture that was respectful yet firm, a balance that reflected years of experience navigating situations where authority and arrogance collided with patience and skill. Richard Collins leaned forward slightly, his voice lowered but still carrying the weight of expectation, questioning whether she truly understood her place in that dining room. Ava replied calmly that she understood perfectly, but her comprehension extended far beyond the simple duties of server. It encompassed the awareness of human behavior, the subtle influence of observation, and the capacity to respond with measured dignity in the face of disrespect. The room around them seemed to adjust to the gravity of the exchange. The ambient sounds of clinking glassware and low conversation fading into a background hum as diners and servers alike became subtly attuned to the interaction unfolding at the central table. Ava continued to maintain eye contact with Richard Collins, allowing a faint pause between words that amplified their significance without breaking the quiet control she had established. She explained, in a tone that was firm yet unassuming, that respect and professionalism were not granted by a tip or an outward display of wealth, but rather earned through mutual consideration and integrity, a statement that seemed to hang in the air like a carefully placed note of warning and reflection. Richard Collins shifted slightly in his seat, the tension in his shoulders increasing as he processed the quiet authority in her words, while his friends glanced at one another, recognizing the shift in energy they had not anticipated. Ava then took a subtle step back, signaling the completion of her message without further confrontation, and allowed the table to settle while maintaining her poised demeanor. Nearby diners exchanged glances, some nodding imperceptibly, acknowledging the composure that Ava exhibited and the unexpected challenge it presented to a figure accustomed to unquestioned dominance. Ava's attention remained vigilant, her senses attuned to every movement and sound within the restaurant, ready to respond should the situation escalate. Yet confident in the quiet power she now wielded through patience, observation, and unwavering professionalism. The $5 bill still lay on the table, a small symbol of the imbalance Richard Collins had attempted to enforce. Yet Ava had subtly reclaimed control over the interaction without uttering a word of anger or defiance, allowing the silent statement of her integrity to resonate more strongly than any overt confrontation could have. The warm light from the chandeliers continued to illuminate the scene, highlighting the subtle expressions of both Ava and Richard Collins as the moment stretched, a tense but controlled interval before the next chapter of the evening would unfold, foreshadowing the revelations that were yet to come and the eventual reversal of perceived power that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. Ava Johnson stepped back toward the kitchen entrance, her hands still gripping the tray with quiet strength, and allowed herself a moment to gather her thoughts before continuing her service for the evening. The restaurant had regained a semblance of normal rhythm. The clatter of dishes, the soft chatter of diners, and the faint hum of background music filling the space once again, but the tension at Richard Collins' table lingered like an invisible shadow, a subtle pressure that reminded her of the power imbalance she had faced only minutes before. She moved with deliberate precision, threading carefully between diners and servers, her eyes scanning the room with awareness of every subtle gesture and glance that might indicate attention or concern. A young child seated at a nearby table watched her curiously, tilting their head and whispering something to a parent, perhaps sensing the quiet dignity that Ava carried so effortlessly. Ava allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod in response before turning her attention to the plates she needed to clear, each movement methodical and controlled, reinforcing the sense of calm she maintained in the midst of a subtly charged atmosphere. Richard Collins shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the polished surface of the table with a rhythmic intensity, a physical manifestation of the agitation he could not entirely mask. Ava noted this carefully, understanding that his discomfort was not born solely from the situation, but from encountering someone whose composure challenged his expectations of authority and submission. She bent slightly to lift an empty plate, her back straight, eyes forward, aware of the gaze of diners who had witnessed the earlier exchange, recognizing perhaps in their own ways the contrast between arrogance and quiet confidence. She moved to refill a water glass for a nearby diner, her hand steady as she poured slowly, allowing the liquid to catch the light, the small act conveying care and attention in a way that contrasted sharply with the prior cruelty of Richard Collins' remarks. A server passing with a tray of desserts nodded subtly at her, acknowledging her calm under pressure, and Ava responded with a polite smile, maintaining the delicate balance between service and silent assertion. From across the room, Richard Collins caught the movement and leaned slightly forward, his expression sharpening as he tried to read her intentions. Yet the clarity in Ava's eyes offered no clues, only a steady presence that seemed to silently assert control. The faint click of a camera shutter from a friend at the table reminded her that every detail was being observed. Yet she remained unfazed, her awareness and experience guiding her through the delicate choreography of the room. As she straightened again and moved toward the edge of the dining area, Ava allowed herself a brief internal reflection on the skill required to navigate spaces where authority and arrogance collide with patience and quiet strength, recognizing that the ability to maintain composure and dignity was as much a tool of power as any overt display of dominance. She returned to the table once more, offering a measured word of thanks to the diners for their patience, her voice calm and even, reinforcing the sense of professional poise she embodied. Richard Collins shifted again, the subtle tension in his jaw betraying the recognition that the straightforward, calm demeanor of the waitress had begun to unsettle the carefully maintained hierarchy he had assumed existed in that space. Ava stepped back slightly, giving the table a wide berth, her posture deliberate and controlled, allowing the atmosphere to settle while the silent assertion of her integrity radiated outward, a quiet yet unmistakable force that altered the perception of those present without a single word of confrontation or anger. The warm glow from the chandeliers above illuminated the scene, highlighting the contrast between Richard Collins' rigid posture and Ava Johnson's relaxed yet commanding presence, a visual reminder that composure, skill, and quiet dignity often carry more influence than brash authority. The room around her continued with its ordinary rhythm, yet the subtle shift in energy was palpable, and Ava recognized that the stage had been set for the next pivotal moment, one that would test the perception of power and reveal the true measure of respect and recognition in the interactions that followed. Ava Johnson stepped into the small break area behind the kitchen, the low hum of conversation and clinking dishes from the dining room reaching her ears like distant music. She set her tray down carefully, the weight of the plates grounding her in the quiet moment. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, but her posture remained poised, a subtle signal of control despite the lingering tension from the previous exchange. She reached for a glass of water and took a deliberate sip, letting the cool liquid wash over her dry throat, her thoughts moving back to the table where Richard Collins sat, his expression still taut with an unfamiliar unease. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft glow across the room, highlighting the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead from the long shift and the mental effort required to maintain composure under scrutiny. Ava allowed herself a brief moment to glance at the schedule pinned to the wall, noting the flow of upcoming orders, but her mind returned quickly to the subtle psychological game unfolding in the dining room. She knew that every subtle gesture she had made, every measured word, had created ripples across the room that were beginning to unsettle Richard Collins, though he would not admit it aloud. The quiet strength she had maintained was now a force, influencing not only his perception of her, but the perception of the diners who had witnessed the exchange. Ava straightened and exhaled slowly, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat in her chest as she prepared to return to the dining area. She stepped lightly across the floor, her shoes making almost no sound on the polished surface, and moved toward the table with measured grace, every movement deliberate and controlled. Richard Collins' eyes followed her, narrowing slightly as he tried to reassert the dominance he believed he had once held, but Ava remained unfazed, her gaze steady and calm, projecting a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with his visible tension. As she approached the table, she acknowledged a few diners with a polite nod, a small act that conveyed warmth and attentiveness without inviting distraction, reinforcing the distinction between professionalism and the arrogance of Richard Collins. She placed her hands lightly on the tray, ready to clear the empty plates, but paused just enough to hold the attention of the room, letting the silence stretch and emphasize the quiet power she now subtly exerted. The chandeliers overhead reflected off the polished surfaces, creating gentle highlights across the edges of the table and the glassware, accentuating the contrast between her composed presence and the rich man's forced posture. Ava spoke quietly to the diners nearby, thanking them for their patience as the table was cleared, her words measured, soft, and carrying a weight that seemed to settle the air without confrontation. Richard Collins shifted again in his seat, his fingers brushing against the edge of the table with a slight tremor that went unnoticed by most, yet Ava registered it immediately, interpreting the movement as a sign that the first cracks in his confidence were beginning to form. She bent slightly to lift the plates, careful not to disturb the positioning of the $5 bill, her actions precise, almost ceremonial, demonstrating control without a word. Nearby, other servers moved through the space, their eyes catching her composure and the subtle power she carried in a setting where she was supposed to be at the lowest rung, their expressions reflecting a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Ava placed the last plate onto the tray, her movements fluid, and stepped back to allow the table to breathe, maintaining eye contact with Richard Collins long enough to remind him silently that his attempted assertion of authority had been met with quiet resilience. She allowed the moment to settle, knowing that patience and observation were her allies, and that every subtle gesture and carefully measured pause reinforced the balance of dignity and control she maintained in a space designed to challenge both. The warm light of the restaurant reflected softly against the glasses and polished surfaces, creating a quiet tableau of tension, anticipation, and the unspoken understanding that the next shift in the evening would bring events that no one present would soon forget, as Ava Johnson moved through the space with unwavering composure, prepared for the pivotal moment that would soon redefine the perception of power and respect in that room. Ava Johnson returned to the table where Richard Collins sat, her movements calm yet deliberate, carrying the tray with a quiet authority that drew the attention of nearby diners without a single word. She placed the tray carefully on the sideboard, positioning it so that it did not interfere with the table while keeping the focus subtly on her presence. Richard Collins lifted his hand, gesturing impatiently for her to move, but Ava remained composed, her posture straight, shoulders relaxed, and eyes steady on him. The subtle shift in energy at the table was palpable, a silent tension that seemed to ripple through the restaurant as other diners noticed the unusual dynamic unfolding before them. Ava spoke softly, directing her attention to the empty plates and glasses, explaining that she would clear them promptly so that the table could continue enjoying their meal. Yet her voice carried a quiet authority that reminded Richard Collins that she was not intimidated by his previous insult. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and said something about how people like her should know their place, but the words faltered as he realized that Ava would not respond with fear or apology. She moved with precise, controlled steps, lifting each plate and glass carefully, and her movements conveyed competence and calm in a space designed to challenge her dignity. The polished oak table reflected the soft glow of the overhead chandeliers, highlighting the contrast between the rigidity of Richard Collins' posture and the fluid poise of Ava Johnson as she navigated the space. A few diners near the table shifted slightly, watching the subtle battle of composure and authority, their curiosity mingling with admiration for the calm resilience displayed by the young waitress. Ava paused briefly as she placed the last plate onto the tray, her eyes sweeping the room to ensure that nothing had been disturbed, that the $5 bill remained in its place, and that the diners remained unintruded upon by the tension at the table. She took a measured breath and glanced once at Richard Collins, noticing the tight line of his jaw and the slight furrow in his brow, subtle signs that her quiet control was beginning to unsettle him. Her movements back toward the edge of the dining area were deliberate, each step reinforcing the calm authority she held, a presence that seemed to occupy the space without threatening it overtly, yet asserting influence through observation, patience, and unwavering poise. The restaurant continued around her, the low hum of conversation, the occasional clink of cutlery, and the soft laughter of diners providing a background rhythm. But the energy at Richard Collins' table had shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of the challenge to his assumed dominance. Ava paused at the kitchen entrance, placing the tray down momentarily, allowing herself a brief reflection on the careful balance she maintained between service and assertion. knowing that the evening had only just begun and that her composure would be a defining element in the events that followed. She returned to the table with renewed focus, her gaze steady and cleared. The remaining items, each motion deliberate and unhurried, ensuring that her movements communicated confidence without confrontation. Richard Collins shifted once more, his fingers drumming lightly against the table as he attempted to reassert his presence. But the subtle tension in his posture revealed that the quiet dignity of Ava Johnson was beginning to command attention in a way that he had not anticipated. Nearby diners whispered softly among themselves, noting the unusual calm in her actions and the way her measured presence contrasted sharply with the arrogance of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority. Ava placed the tray back on the sideboard and allowed the room to settle, her gaze lingering briefly on Richard Collins, a silent reminder that composure, patience, and quiet confidence could speak louder than any raised voice or forced display of power. The warm light from the chandeliers above reflected off the glasses and polished surfaces, casting gentle highlights that accentuated the difference between the tension of the rich man and the serenity of the young waitress, setting the stage for the next pivotal moment in the evening that would redefine the perception of respect and authority in the room. A gentle chime sounded from the front entrance as Daniel Brooks, the owner of the restaurant, stepped into the warm glow of the dining area, his presence immediately drawing attention from the staff and diners alike. He was dressed in a crisp navy suit with a tie neatly knotted, and his polished shoes echoed softly against the hardwood floor as he walked toward the central table. Ava Johnson noticed his arrival instantly, her posture straightening even further, her dark eyes meeting his for a brief moment of acknowledgement before returning to her composed focus on the task at hand. Richard Collins, seated with his friends, shifted slightly in his chair, a subtle tension rippling across his shoulders as he followed Daniel Brooks with a wary glance. The quiet murmur of diners faded into a background hum as the room registered the owner's commanding presence. Daniel approached the table with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze scanning the room and landing finally on Ava. He paused for just a moment, taking in her calm composure, the way she stood with quiet confidence despite the subtle chaos of the evening. Ava responded with a small nod, a gesture that was at once respectful and self-assured, signaling that she was fully aware of the dynamics at play without inviting unnecessary attention. Richard Collins cleared his throat, attempting to maintain an air of authority, but the slight furrow in his brow betrayed a hint of unease he could not hide. Daniel spoke with a firm yet calm voice that carried across the table without raising the volume, addressing Ava directly while also ensuring that Richard and his friends could hear each word. He asked her name, confirming the presence of a young woman who had just navigated a delicate confrontation with professionalism and poise. Ava replied evenly, stating her full name as she had on her name tag, maintaining her measured tone and controlled demeanor. Daniel nodded slightly, as if registering something beyond her name, a recognition that the quiet strength she displayed had more depth than the uniform suggested. Richard Collins attempted to interject, but Daniel raised a hand subtly, signaling for patience, and his calm authority seemed to momentarily freeze Richard mid-gesture. The room held its breath as Ava continued to stand poised, her movements minimal but deliberate, emphasizing the subtle control she exercised over the situation without the need for confrontation. A nearby server glanced at Ava with quiet admiration, noting the way she maintained composure in a high-pressure environment, balancing professionalism with personal dignity, a balance that few could achieve under the gaze of an audience or the scrutiny of someone accustomed to unchallenged dominance. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on Ava, and he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, as though acknowledging the quiet courage and presence of mind that had guided her through the tension of the previous moments. Richard Collins, realizing that the dynamics at the table had shifted subtly but significantly, leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the polished surface of the table, a nervous rhythm that reflected his awareness that the balance of power was no longer entirely in his control. Ava noticed the change, though her expression remained neutral, a calm observance that reinforced the strength and dignity she carried without fanfare or arrogance. Daniel continued toward the table, his voice soft but authoritative, asking how the evening had been going and inquiring discreetly about the service. Ava responded with measured words, detailing the flow of the tables and acknowledging the needs of diners with quiet efficiency, her calm and precise tone reinforcing the professional control she maintained. The subtle tension between Richard Collins and Ava had not escalated into overt conflict, but the room sensed the shift, the quiet assertion of presence by Ava Johnson beginning to tip the perception of authority in ways that were invisible yet undeniable. As she straightened and prepared to move to the next task, Daniel gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the resilience and composure she exhibited, signaling that the presence of someone with integrity and quiet power could alter the dynamics in any room without a single display of aggression. The chandeliers above reflected their warm light across the polished surfaces, accentuating the subtle expressions and posture of all three figures, a tableau of patience, observation, and unspoken understanding that had set the stage for the revelations yet to unfold in the evening. A sudden shift occurred in the room as Daniel Brooks stepped closer to the table, his presence commanding attention without a word. Richard Collins, who had been leaning slightly forward in a display of confidence, straightened abruptly, realizing that the dynamics of the evening were about to change in a way he had not anticipated. Ava Johnson remained calm, her posture straight and her gaze steady, meeting Daniel Brooks' eyes for a fleeting moment that conveyed recognition and silent approval. Daniel spoke in a voice that was firm but composed, addressing Ava directly, and the words seemed to reverberate across the polished surfaces of the dining area. He said, with clarity and calm authority, that he was aware of her full credentials, that her presence in the restaurant this evening as a waitress did not reflect the depth of experience and skill she possessed. The statement hung in the air, a quiet revelation that shifted the tension of the room, drawing the attention of diners, servers, and even Richard Collins, who now sat back in his chair, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Ava allowed a subtle smile, one that acknowledged the recognition without overt pride, a controlled display of confidence that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy Richard Collins now exhibited. The chandeliers above reflected their warm light across the room, illuminating the subtle changes in posture and expression that marked the beginning of a reversal in perceived power. Ava explained quietly, with measured words, that she had once worked in high-pressure environments where precision, calm, and composure were essential too, outcomes that affected lives directly, and that while her uniform this evening suggested ordinary service, the skills she carried were of a different order entirely. Richard Collins' mouth opened slightly, as though to speak, but the words failed him, the weight of the revelation rendering him momentarily silent. The diners nearby began to sense the shift, their attention drawn by the unspoken authority that now emanated from Ava Johnson through the recognition of Daniel Brooks. She moved with deliberate care as she adjusted the placement of the tray and plates, ensuring that every action remained calm and composed, reinforcing the quiet strength she wielded. Daniel nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and the acknowledgement of her competence became a silent but powerful signal to the room that the evening had taken a turn, that the previous assumptions of power and hierarchy were no longer absolute. Richard Collins shifted in his seat again, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his awareness that his earlier display of dominance had been met with a presence and dignity he had underestimated. Ava remained poised, her dark eyes calm, and allowed the situation to unfold with careful observation, knowing that patience and measured composure could have a more profound effect than any direct confrontation. The soft murmur of conversation and the faint clinking of dishes in the background provided a rhythm that contrasted with the heightened tension at the central table, highlighting the subtle transformation in authority. Ava's movements were precise as she prepared to step back toward the service corridor, each gesture reinforcing the quiet command she held over the space, a reminder that true respect and influence often came from the control of one's composure rather than overt displays of wealth or intimidation. The $5 bill still lay on the table, insignificant in comparison to the revelation now known to Richard Collins, yet remained as a silent symbol of the challenge to his assumed superiority. The warm lighting of the restaurant accentuated the expressions and postures of all involved, emphasizing the subtle but unmistakable shift in perception, a moment that would be remembered long after the evening ended, and marking the first true twist in the balance of power as Ava Johnson quietly asserted the depth of her experience, her calm authority, and the undeniable dignity that had long been overlooked. Ava Johnson stepped back slightly, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the tray as she allowed the tension at the table to settle for a heartbeat. Richard Collins sat frozen in place, his eyes wide, mouth slightly open, trying to reconcile the calm composure of the young waitress with the sudden revelation that had just been quietly disclosed by Daniel Brooks. The realization that she was not merely a server, that her experience and accomplishments extended far beyond the polished floors of the restaurant, hit him with a force that left him momentarily speechless. He leaned back, the weight of embarrassment pressing subtly against the posture he had so confidently maintained, and for the first time that evening, his friends exchanged glances filled with uncertainty, sensing the shift in balance without fully understanding its origin. Ava remained still, her dark eyes focused, showing no trace of triumph, only a quiet strength that seemed to command attention through its very restraint. Daniel Brooks nodded subtly, a small confirmation that the young woman had indeed managed to navigate a delicate confrontation with dignity and skill, and his presence reinforced the authority of her position in a manner that was calm, unassuming, yet undeniable. Richard Collins took a deep breath, his hands lightly brushing the table, the polished surface reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above, and he began to question, internally, the assumptions he had carried about status, entitlement, and respect. The diners who had been watching shifted in their seats, leaning slightly forward, their curiosity heightened as they witnessed the subtle interplay of authority, composure, and revelation unfold before them. Ava adjusted her posture, straightening her back and keeping her gaze level, her voice calm and measured as she acknowledged Daniel Brooks' question about the table service, providing precise answers that reflected not only her attentiveness in the dining room, but also the depth of skill and awareness she had cultivated over years of high-pressure work. The soft hum of conversation, the occasional clink of silverware, and the faint murmur of laughter from distant tables contrasted sharply with the tension at Richard Collins' table, emphasizing the quiet authority that Ava now exercised without raising her voice or demonstrating overt dominance. He shifted slightly in his seat, the nervous rhythm of his fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface betraying his recognition that the young waitress had achieved something he could not counter with wealth, volume, or social standing alone. Ava moved her hands to adjust the placement of the remaining glassware, precise and deliberate, allowing the room to perceive her as both attentive and composed, demonstrating control over the immediate environment in a manner that subtly but effectively rebalanced the dynamic of the space. Daniel Brooks' eyes met hers for a moment, conveying an understanding and respect that further underscored the shift in authority, and Richard Collins could only sit, absorbing the quiet yet undeniable demonstration of competence and poise. Ava stepped back to the edge of the dining area, her movements fluid, measured, and deliberate, maintaining her composure as she allowed the silent acknowledgement of her skills and presence to resonate within the room. The chandeliers overhead cast warm highlights across the polished tables and glassware, illuminating the subtle expressions of awe, curiosity, and realization on the faces of those observing, creating a tableau that captured the moment when perceived power was quietly yet decisively challenged. Richard Collins exhaled slowly, a subtle but unmistakable sign of internal conflict as he processed the events, while Ava Johnson maintained her steady presence, her quiet strength and integrity leaving a lasting impression that would remain in the room long after the evening service had ended. Every step she took, Every small gesture and carefully measured action reinforced the lesson that dignity, skill, and patience could command respect and shift perceptions without a single display of aggression. And the room held its breath, awaiting the next chapter in this unfolding evening of revelation and subtle redemption. Ava Johnson stood silently for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the tray as she allowed the subtle tension in the room to settle, knowing that the next words would shift the dynamics even further. Daniel Brooks, the owner, stepped closer to the table, his presence commanding but calm, and he spoke directly to Richard Collins in a voice that carried both authority and clarity. He explained that Ava was not merely a waitress, that she had trained for years in high-pressure environments where precision, focus, and composure were essential to outcomes that could determine life or death, and that her appearance in the restaurant tonight did not reflect the depth of her skill or her accomplishments. Richard Collins sat frozen, blinking rapidly as he attempted to process the information, the words hanging in the air like a revelation that had caught him completely unprepared. His fingers drummed lightly on the polished surface of the table, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his awareness that his prior display of arrogance had been met with someone whose capabilities far exceeded the assumptions he had made. Ava remained poised, her dark eyes steady and calm, conveying an unspoken confidence that reinforced the authority and respect Daniel Brooks had just communicated. The diners around the table leaned slightly forward, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding revelation, sensing the dramatic shift in the balance of perception and authority without needing to hear the specifics of her training. Daniel Brooks continued, subtly highlighting instances where Ava had demonstrated exceptional skill, quietly underscoring that the woman before them was not to be underestimated or dismissed based on uniform or role alone. Ava's gaze remained fixed on the table, acknowledging the acknowledgement without arrogance, allowing the words to settle in the room and create a moment of collective reflection. Richard Collins exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders relaxing slightly as the impact of the revelation sank in, though his pride made it difficult to admit aloud the full weight of his previous misjudgment. Ava moved her hands gently to adjust the remaining glassware and plates, each motion deliberate and careful, reinforcing the subtle command she now held over the atmosphere of the space without needing to speak further. The soft hum of conversation and distant clinking of cutlery continued around the restaurant, contrasting sharply with the concentrated focus and energy at the table, emphasizing the quiet authority that Ava exercised. Richard Collins shifted once more in his seat, his fingers brushing the table, and he realized that the perception of power he had relied upon was no longer absolute, that dignity and expertise carried influence beyond status or wealth. Ava took a small, deliberate step back, maintaining a posture of calm readiness, signaling that she was prepared for whatever came next while demonstrating that patience and composure could command respect without aggression. Daniel Brooks nodded slightly, affirming the subtle authority and integrity Ava had shown, and the room sensed a realignment in perception, an unspoken acknowledgement that the young woman had quietly yet decisively asserted her presence. The chandeliers above reflected light across the polished surfaces, highlighting the expressions and posture of all three figures, capturing the subtle but undeniable shift in the room, as the combination of competence, dignity, and calm had effectively redefined the balance of respect in the space. Ava stood quietly, letting the moment linger, understanding that patience, observation, and measured action had achieved a greater impact than any loud confrontation ever could, and that the influence of quiet strength would continue to resonate across the room long after the service had ended. Ava Johnson stepped away from the central table, the soft hum of the restaurant gradually returning to normal as diners resumed their quiet conversations and the occasional clink of glassware filled the air. Her dark eyes briefly scanned the room, noticing the subtle nods of recognition from servers and diners alike, an unspoken acknowledgement of the quiet authority she had demonstrated that evening. Richard Collins remained seated, his posture slouched slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by a mix of embarrassment and reluctant respect, the weight of his assumptions laid bare in the wake of the revelations. The $5 bill that had been the source of the tension remained on the polished oak table, almost insignificant now compared to the respect and recognition Ava had earned through composure, skill, and quiet strength. Daniel Brooks, the owner, watched her for a moment longer, a small approving smile crossing his face as he silently conveyed gratitude and acknowledgement for the professionalism and dignity she had shown under pressure. Ava collected her tray, moving back toward the service corridor with deliberate, measured steps, each movement calm and controlled, reinforcing the aura of quiet command that had defined her interactions throughout the evening. She passed by diners who now regarded her with curiosity and admiration rather than idle observation, and she returned subtle gestures of acknowledgement with soft, polite nods, never allowing pride or arrogance to color her demeanor. Richard Collins finally cleared his throat, his voice hesitant, and offered a quiet apology, acknowledging the misjudgment he had made in assuming his social and financial status could dictate the behavior or respect of someone else. Ava merely nodded in response, accepting the acknowledgement without malice, demonstrating that true dignity lay in restraint and composure rather than confrontation or revenge. The chandeliers above reflected warm light across the dining room, highlighting the soft expressions of realization and respect on the faces of the diners and staff alike, a tableau of silent understanding and moral reckoning that carried an understated weight far beyond the immediate moment. Ava placed the tray down at the sideboard near the kitchen entrance, allowed herself a deep breath, and for the first time that evening, permitted a small smile to touch her lips, a quiet acknowledgement of the triumph of patience, composure, and integrity over arrogance and entitlement. Daniel Brooks moved past her toward the front entrance, pausing only to offer a few words of quiet praise for the way she had handled the situation, and Ava acknowledged them with a simple nod, letting her actions speak more loudly than any words could. Richard Collins and his friends quietly settled the bill, leaving the restaurant with a subdued energy, the earlier display of dominance replaced by reflective humility, as the subtle lesson had clearly left its mark. The rest of the diners returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly, infused with a sense of respect and awareness that quiet strength and professionalism could carry more influence than status, wealth, or loud declarations of power. Ava returned to her duties with measured efficiency, moving through the dining room with the calm assurance of someone who had navigated far greater challenges and emerged with her dignity intact. The $5 bill, now a silent reminder of a lesson learned, remained on the table, uncollected, a symbol of the contrast between fleeting arrogance and enduring respect. As the evening progressed, Ava continued to serve with quiet grace, every gesture measured, every movement deliberate, her presence a steady reminder that composure, intelligence, and integrity could shift perceptions and command respect without a single raised voice. The warm lighting, the gentle clatter of dishes, and the soft murmur of conversations formed a backdrop for the subtle but profound reversal that had occurred, a moment of moral clarity and redemption that left an impression on everyone present. Ava Johnson moved through the restaurant one final time before the end of service, her steps deliberate and calm, her dark eyes reflecting quiet satisfaction, and with a final nod to Daniel Brooks, she stepped toward the back in trance, leaving the polished dining room behind, a space forever changed by the quiet strength and dignity she had carried so effortlessly. The evening concluded not with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, but with a clear, definitive resolution. Respect earned through composure and integrity had triumphed over arrogance and entitlement. And the lesson lingered in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, a testament to the power of quiet strength.